It's the Abba podcast. Let's go. And welcome to the next guest on the podcast, Professor Tim Anderson. How are we, Tim?
Good, thanks, Abbas. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. So you're an Australian academic, you're a writer, you're an internationalist, you're an advocate for human rights, and many more things. Tell us what inspired you to go down this path and this avenue.
That's a little tricky. You know, we've all got our own histories, where we came from and where we ended up. And I guess my conscience was aroused when I was young over the first political issue that really aroused my conscience was the execution of prisoners, the death penalty. I remember when I was about 12, they executed the last man in Australia, and there was a big campaign around that. Then the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War affected a lot of us who were kids at school, basically, and I went on my first demonstration against the Vietnam War. And then, unfortunately, ever since then, I've seen the armed forces of my own country not defending the country, but going into other countries, and
We might be having a bit of technical difficulties. We have momentarily lost Tim, hoping for the technical difficulties to go away. Well, we've got Tim Anderson. He's an Australian academic, an activist, senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. Okay, sorry, Tim, we lost you for a bit. I tried to keep him in tune with who you were. The last we heard was the Vietnam War and what inspired you to continue in this path.
Yeah, so I suppose the impact on me of the wars that my country was involved in was very important, and ever since the late 60s, that's bothered me seriously. So when I moved into academia eventually later on in life, then I stayed with that sense that and also I suppose along the way I gathered this idea that if you are writing, if you're an intellectual, if you're engaged in discussions, there had to be some relationship between that and practical social activism, let's say, active citizenship, let's say.
So talking about active citizenship, we're coming off a day which is very controversial in the Australian history. So we're looking at Australia Day, a day that claims to be unifying all Australians. Yet ironically, it's a diverse day for most, and especially people in academia and people that are in the know. So give us your stance on what Australia Day means to you, and is it more so Invasion Day rather than Australia Day?
Well, the whole idea of an Australia Day based on when the British colonists first arrived in Sydney is something that's always been controversial, really ridiculous in many respects. There hasn't really been a coming to terms with the fact of colonisation in this country. And the voices of Aboriginal people have been important in that, but they weren't really very strong on the issue of this 26th of January day until probably the late 80s, 1988, which is now quite a long time ago. It's 32 years ago, but that was the time when there was a flourishing of a huge Aboriginal reaction to that day, because it was the 200th anniversary of the arrival of the first colonist fleet, basically. And so there was a huge rally, and the beginning of those commemorations were called Survival Day and Invasion Day there. And that is really, I noticed being at the rally yesterday that a lot of young people who've grown up in that last 32 years, they've gone through school in that period, that they have been educated, they have learned something that my generation didn't, basically, about Australian history. But that's still ongoing, because you can see a lot of our political leaders are not very comfortable with that whole idea. We've got a prime minister who's kicking back against that because he comes from a tradition which doesn't really recognise colonisation and the legacies of colonisation in this country.
So what would you say to people, the general layman that comes out and say, why can't we just celebrate Australia Day? We can't control issue, we can't take it back and let bygones be bygones. What would your answer to be to most of the people that do say that?
Well, because we're still living with the consequences of colonisation. We can't run a truck over the top of colonisation here and say we'll celebrate this day, which is a day of mourning or survival, for indigenous people. It's not a proper recognition of history. Now, you find the same people who say, let bygone be bygones, that want to celebrate, for example, the Australian invasion of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire in 1915, and celebrate that as Anzac Day these days, So really, people are very selective in their choices of dates in history when they talk about forget about the past, but I will remember this thing in the past.
Yeah, it's like they almost negate the intergenerational trauma, the generational poverty, health disparity, the disconnection from culture, disappearance of language, family separation, social discrimination, and much more. So when we're looking at things that the Aboriginal people or the Indigenous people of Australia have faced, it's almost a slap in the face that Australia Day is actually something that's celebrated. When we look at the worldview and what we see and we perceive the innocence and the lives that are lost in Palestine, Yemen, and all the countries that are taken advantage of, what is the difference between those countries and what happened here in Australia to the Indigenous people?
It's a very good parallel, really, because it's not just that things are happening in those countries. Australia is an active participant in the things that are happening, the invasions, the proxy wars, the fact that Australia has been exposed as being involved in war crimes in Afghanistan. We have to see that alongside the Australian involvement in war crimes in Iraq, the direct involvement of the Australian Air Force in the attacks on Syrian soldiers a few years ago to help Daesh in that country, the support that Australia gives for Israel for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, for the invasions of Lebanon, for example. All of those things are ongoing. And so this is why the mentality of colonization and neo-colonialism is really important for us to address. We can't really have a progressive or patriotism, for example, which is like the patriotism you see in a lot of Arab countries and Latin American countries, where their patriotism is about supporting a nation that gained its independence and defends itself. Our patriotism has been based on this sort of chauvinism that was linked into British imperialism and later on US imperialism. So it's very important to draw those parallels, I think. It's a good point you make.
So yeah, look, it is important because even if you look at the term Holocaust, now Holocaust is from the Greek word holoskostos, which comes from a complete annihilation and a complete burning of people. And if you really want to look at, okay, yes, what happened in the Holocaust is something that no human comes out and says that it's acceptable in any way, shape or form. But then you draw the parallel to see what happened here in Australia. How is it out of the realm of possibility, or is it ridiculous or preposterous to say it was a Holocaust to what happened to the Aboriginal people?
It was a genocide, and there's no doubt about it. And in the Americas, the same sort of thing on a larger scale. In fact, the genocide in the Americas is probably the largest genocide in history. So we shouldn't use the crimes against one European community, the Holocaust of the Jewish people, which came after centuries of discrimination in Europe, to perpetuate or to initiate new Holocausts in Palestine or in Australia, or to ignore the fact that those sort of processes happened in the process of colonization, in the process of imperial ambitions, basically. We need to understand genocides in their historical context, I think, as the great Jewish, Polish writer Raphael Lemkin wrote, genocide is a recurring pattern in history as a result of imperialism and the colonization of imperialism.
So yeah, it's an interesting point. And what would you say to people to say, why are we crying victims now, all of a sudden, let bygones be bygones? They don't really realize that the Aboriginal people never had a voice or never classified as humans. And in 1902, we have in Tasmania, a parliament member comes out and says, there's no scientific evidence as to them being humans. So,
Yeah.
It's really naive to people to think that, why they come in to wreck our day, let us enjoy our day in peace and let us have a barbecue, so on and so forth. So it's a long-winded question, but the question's going along the lines, all these organizations that come out and they embrace the day and they come out and they say Happy Australia Day to fit in. What does that say about the values of that business, industry, sporting organization, etc.?
I mean, the people that promote this are not stupid in themselves. A lot of people that are sucked into it are stupid, basically. But we, as socially conscious people, we shouldn't have that big gap in our social consciousness. We should be aware of history. Let me give you one little example. Most of my grandparents are from Scotland, some from Ireland, some from England. The Scottish ones, some of the Scottish ones came out in the early 19th century to Tasmania. Now, they were poor sheep farmers driven off the land that emigrated to Tasmania, eventually got their way into the landed class, got some land, and then had to take part in the ethnic cleansing of Tasmania in an operation called the Black Line in October 1830. So as a result of that, my grandmother, who was one of their grandchildren, moved into the middle class, got educated, became a school teacher, and I ended up with a middle class background. So across a century and a half, more than a century and a half, the benefits of those of us who are the descendants of the colonists benefited from that process, and we should recognise that history. It's not to say you have to feel guilty, but you have to be aware of it, and you have to do something about it that recognises our own particular history here. I'm not Scottish. I grew up in this country. My parents were born in this country, but we can't ignore our own history, and we can't walk roughshod over the history of other people in particular. Otherwise, we'll keep repeating those sorts of crimes. You see, the point I'm making there is that the poor Scots participated, who were ethnically cleansed themselves in a sense. Well, it was class cleansing. They were kicked off the land in highland clearances, like the poor Irish that left after the famine. They came here and took part in the clearances in this country. And you could say the same thing about the victims, the Jewish victims in Europe. They went to Palestine and they committed a similar crime against the Palestinian people. So if people are not conscious of their own history, they'll perpetuate those sorts of crimes.
So the importance of understanding what the day is and the history of the day is to make sure that we put the line in the sand and we move on and we move forward to give opportunities to make sure that this doesn't happen.
We have to learn lessons from our own history, yeah.
So yeah, that's very important, because a lot of the detractors and the deterrorists come out and they say that, these political activists, they have an agenda. If you're not happy, move out of the country, leave. No one's forcing you to stay. So you feel like the arguments are pretty more personal and emotional, and that they really don't answer any of the problems that we've touched upon.
Yeah, people that say those sorts of things are usually not very aware of their own circumstances and their own history, more or less, and they lash out. And in Western culture, it's become a sort of thing, because of extreme individualism and cynicism, to lash out and be abusive about these sorts of things rather than learn lessons. So for people to lash out and say, well, you leave your country, what? I mean, we are as much citizens as they are, presumably. So it's not really a very cultured or educated response, basically, and we don't take it seriously for that reason.
Yeah, no, that's very important. So tell us about what pushes you to continue to strive in this path, because it's really a thankless industry. With yourself, you've been on the bad end of many things. Your Facebook continuously gets blocked. You lost your position as the head professor at the Sydney University because of a stance or opinions that you had. What's the importance of plurality of opinion if an academic personality like yourself can't express himself?
Well, yeah, you're right. But in a sense, I'm lucky. I'm in a privileged position in a way, because I'm financially independent. I'm at a time in my life when I haven't been looking for promotion or anything like that. I've been rather making use of my position at universities for almost 35 years to say the things I want to say. So in a sense, I've enjoyed, and I still enjoy, intellectual freedom, but really what came to a head with my confrontation with some of the managers at Sydney University, who were effectively worried about their image being run down because of the Israel lobby and what they were doing there, and the Israeli funders of the university I was at, for example. It's really a useful exercise in my view. It doesn't hurt me that much. It affects a lot of young academics a lot more, because you imagine if you're young and you want promotion and you've got a mortgage and kids and all those sorts of things, you're going to be seriously intimidated by those sorts of threats. Whereas I don't have kids, I don't have a mortgage, I'm financially independent. I thought about this for a number of years, before I called their bluff effectively. And so I'm just in a lucky position where I can say, no, it's worth more to me than my job to maintain my freedom of expression, and particularly my capacity to criticize the colonial imperial powers in this world that are destroying people's lives systematically. And as human beings, I just feel, well, some people don't feel able to lift their voice, but I have the freedom to do that. So It's something that I get some fulfillment out of, and if I don't do it, what's the point of me, having a voice and writing and so on, if I don't say things that really are important to me and to my conscience?
Yeah, look, it's very admirable. And I took a similar, like I take lessons and I learn from many individuals and yourself included. And that's why I started this platform. It's more so that I can gain the knowledge that I have. But if I'm relying on an institution to give me a voice or someone to give me an opportunity, more often than not, I'm going to be let down and disappointed. So I'm striving to create a platform to ensure that, yes, your voice can be heard. Yes, you can, go and strive and study and become
Mm.
masters in your field, but people might not give you the opportunity. And sometimes you should give yourself that opportunity. And with the era of social media, we are blessed
Mm.
in a way where people still hear our voices like I do you.
Yeah, you're right. We have a voice. We're lucky in that sense. We do have a voice, and there are technical means by which we can use that voice. And of course, as a thinking, conscious human being, it's something that gives us fulfillment in our life too, doesn't it? It's something that you feel fulfilled in. Not everyone goes to a job just to earn more money and to screw other people and be an extreme individual, as Western culture does. I suppose we have to get some values to do that from somewhere. Some people have a religious inspiration. Some, like myself, are humanists, and we have an inspiration from humanist values we've learned from different places. But then we come out into the world and we have to speak in a universal language, or perhaps a secular language that gets through to other people. But we do draw on some basic values that we've learned along the way to be able to do that, I think.
Yeah, that's important. And especially the responsibility of someone with knowledge is to give that knowledge. And if you're going to take a stance against oppression, I think it's one where it's reasonable, because if you're silent and you're in the know, you're just as bad as them, because you're just letting them get away with, murder.
I take it as a great opportunity that being in an internationalist field, or that is to say, going to other cultures, visiting other cultures, learning lessons from other cultures, you have to consider yourself as a student. We're all students. We're all learning in this process. There was a Latin American thinker, Jose Marti, who said, learning begins in the cradle and it ends in the grave. Our life is a lifelong process of learning. And as another great Chinese thinker said, Chairman Mao, he said, educate yourself and educate others. So it's a process that I find is a really self-fulfilling process. We don't really need approval from authority figures to do this. It's part of our education that we learn and build our conscience and build our knowledge and share it with others, while remaining relatively humble and recognizing that we are students, we are learning. And I think that's one thing that I've really appreciated about the privilege I've had to be able to travel to a lot of countries, not in the last 9 or 10 months, but before that, visiting other countries and being open, to appreciate as a guest in another country that there are shared values and we can see the benefits of other traditions and other religions and other cultures and so on. And that's really something that's been the most rewarding thing in my life, is to be able to learn in that way.
Yeah, no, it's very important. And even if you were to look at the scriptures, like myself, I'm a Muslim, and that's what motivates me and pushes me to come out and be a voice of justice, or try and make people accountable or aware and in the know. The first verse that came out in the Holy Quran was, read in the name of your Lord who created you. And the greatest benefit, or the greatest attribute God gave to the creation, was intellect. So the ability to derive from the scriptures and from the knowledge, and to this, and to give back to the people, because it's really important, and you shouldn't be stealing. It's like Imam Ali alayhi salam has a hadith, a narration. An orphan isn't someone without a mother and father. An orphan is someone without knowledge. So it's very important in that sense. I definitely do agree. So Tim, we're going to move on to what's going on in this current day and age, coronavirus. How do you feel Australia's tackled this issue, and Scott Morrison in particular?
They're sort of two different things in a way, because the federal government has not really been very good in leadership in this area, and the mess we have between all the states is part of that. It's partly our system, that we have a messy system. This federal system doesn't work very well. But overall, you'd have to say, I have to admit that the Australia has done pretty well. And the figures show it out at the levels of infections and deaths, and the response in world terms is pretty good. I wrote a book about this, and a lot of it was to do with making international comparisons. And so there were some particular problems, like the cruise ship, the way it was unloaded without checks and so on. And And there have been ways in which the police have been used in Melbourne, which have been very unsavoury, and that's to do with the way the police behave generally and the way the governments rely on police solutions and so on. But nevertheless, we have a preventive health system. We have a universal health system, which is far better, for example, than the one in the US, far, far better. And there was a degree of trust between the population, generally speaking, and that health system, which doesn't exist in the US because people see the US, the health system in the US as controlled by big companies and without guarantees, and a type of parasite that's sucking money out of everyone and destroying poor families. So fortunately, we've come out reasonably well, I believe. And even in this state, in New South Wales, in Sydney, where I am, even though it's a Liberal government which has been trying to do a minimal amount of intervention in people's lives, nevertheless, I think they've done a fairly good job. The main theme that I wrote about in this area is the failure of the neoliberal systems, where the privatized health systems, the destruction of preventive health systems, best seen in Britain and the US, where the casualty rate is appalling and is still bad. Most people don't like a lot of the restrictions placed on our lives and so on, and we have to carry out our own individual struggles against that where we are, basically. But I don't like the fact that there's no real plan for opening up the possibility of international travel when a lot of other countries are doing it. But nevertheless, I think that we've been relatively lucky, and a lot of it's been to do with the fact that we do have a decent universal health system, even though it's undermined by privatisation in many respects. It's a cash cow for private operators and so on. But nevertheless, there is a preventive health system, and there's a degree of trust between the people and that health system there. So it's one area where I think our country has done better than a lot of others.
Yeah, and that's credit to the public health system, because we do have something of the the Medicare system and so on and so forth that other countries do not have or unaware of. I recall when Donald Trump came in the days of Bob Hawke, and he was surprised, and he was Medicare. It was like it was the holy grail. And then when he got into office, he done absolutely nothing to improve the public health in America.
No one has been able to create a public health system in the US, unlike most of Western Europe, because most of Western Europe does have universal coverage, and they don't have this managed care thing, which allows the corporations to control it in the US. So, but nevertheless, we've seen disasters in Britain and in France and Italy and Spain too. So and that's also due to the fact of the levels of privatization, the degrading of the preventive and public health systems there, I believe. And I'm just about to write another article on that, because in a number of those countries, which was said to have been the best prepared in the world, Britain and the US in particular, they have done the worst in the world. After a year of this pandemic, more than one person every 1,000 has died from COVID in the US, in Britain, also in France and Italy and Spain, for example. But the US and Britain were put up there as the models of best preparedness to deal with these sorts of emergencies, precisely these sorts of epidemic emergencies. And they were amongst the worst there. We'd add Brazil and other countries like that. But basically, whereas a lot of little countries, not just little countries, China, Cuba, Syria, Vietnam, countries that were placed very low on this neoliberal scale of preparedness, have done the best, have done far better. One, because they're organised and they look after their own people, and they didn't hesitate. When it came to an epidemic, they moved very quickly. Whereas in the US and Britain, one of the key problems was that Boris Johnson in Britain and Trump in the US, for 7 or 8 weeks, they did nothing. They sat around and they said, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's going to go away, we don't have to do anything, we don't want to damage the economy, that sort of thing. After 2 months, their advisors were saying, Mr. President, we've got thousands of people dying, we've got to do something. And they acted very late. And to me, I recall going up into the Blue Mountains in winter, when we were able to travel more outside of Sydney, and seeing that big bushfire that came through last year, and thinking, look, in the Australian context, if you have a big bushfire, and if you let it get big enough to get out of control, you've lost it, basically. It's going to burn itself out, If you get in early, you can contain it. Well, I think an epidemic is like that. An epidemic, you have to move very quickly to deal with it. And some of these countries like Vietnam and China and Cuba and Syria did it relatively well. whereas the countries that claim to be the advanced systems in health preparedness and dealing with epidemics, they failed very badly. And after a year, the runs are on the board, It's a huge, I know a lot of Western people who were cynical and individualistic, said, oh, this is not really a problem, it's a fake, it's a conspiracy and everything. But no, they are real things, epidemics. They happen periodically, and well-organized people can deal with them much better than these extreme individualistic, cynical, privileged societies that we have in Western countries.
So with the pandemic now, we're at a stage where we're moving on to the vaccine process. We're looking at the Pfizers that are coming in and so on and so forth from England and the US. What's your opinion on these vaccinations in comparison to the ones that the Cubans are preparing to dish out as well?
Well, I mean, in a sense, they could all be potentially beneficial, right? There's I think over 300 vaccine candidates. There's about half a dozen of them in operation in the world now. Of course, because of Canberra's political alignments, we're only really looking at either a local one or the British and the North American ones. The North American one is the one with the most question marks over it, to my mind. The British one, we are going to, apparently, we are geared up to produce in Melbourne, and it'll be used in larger numbers than the Pfizer one. It doesn't have to be stored at minus 70 degrees or something mad. But in terms of the other ones, it's no accident that we haven't spoken about the Chinese ones, the Russian ones. The Chinese one, based on more proven technology, that is the older style ones that use deactivated vaccine to produce the antibodies. That's in use around the world. In Brazil, which has a terrible epidemic, they've said that they find it the safest one. The Cubans, Cubans, like the Chinese, are not really running their vaccine industry to make a profit. So in a sense, that makes things much more, let's say, there are less conflicts of interest involved there. The for-profit industries, drug industries, are always going to be more suspect, because we know already they put pressure on for quick approval and so on, and they'll find out about the side effects later on. So, of course, if I had a choice, I would go with the Cuban one and then the Chinese one. But I don't think we're going to have a choice here. And we have to rely to some extent on the approval processes that we can't escape from, that they're going to have to be approved by the health authorities here, which, as I say, we have more trust in than those in the US. So I think I might be lucky in being in about the third rank, because of my age, of perhaps getting the British one, which I think I fear a little bit less than the Pfizer one, than the US one. But we're not really given a choice unless we were somewhere else, because I think that there'll have to be a recognition of equivalence around the world. And, if someone got the Russian vaccine in Lebanon or Syria, they will have to recognise that as a condition of travel. We have to recognise this year and next year, for to travel, there's going to be a regime that says you have to have tests and you have to have a vaccine, and they will have to recognise the fact, even if they don't administer the Cuban or the Chinese vaccine or the Russian vaccine here, they will have to recognise that a lot of countries will be using those ones, because remember also the Cubans are engaged with a lot of Latin American countries and with Iran now. Iran and Cuba have a joint venture in this. Iran is going to help mass produce Cuban technology. They've been working with them for some time. So there will be widespread use of other vaccines around the world other than the British and the American ones. And so the Australian authorities are going to have to come to terms with recognising those ones.
Yeah, because Iran in particular, the supreme leader of Iran, Sayyid Ali al-Khamenei, came out and he said that he does, the American and the British one is not allowed to come into Iran, will not be administered in Iran. He said that a couple of weeks ago. So he shares the opinion that he would not rather trust those opposed to the Cuban ones.
Well, I think he's making a virtue out of necessity there, really, because of the type of sanctions that have been imposed on Iran by the Trump regime and presumably carried on by the Biden regime. They're not going to get it easily in any case. So, the resistance economy idea in Iran is to make a virtue out of necessity and develop your own technologies. And Iran's been very proud about that, about developing its own technology. And of course, it's got partners. It wanted to buy from COVAX, from the UN system, which meant probably that it would be buying Russian or Chinese vaccine. But now it has this agreement with the Cubans to help produce their vaccine. And Iran is also going to develop its own vaccines there too, you know, so they will have to move in that sort of direction. And it's a healthy thing in a way too, that we don't, neither China nor Iran nor Cuba want to be dependent on technology from the US, because the US has proven what a traitor it is in terms of those partnerships. Imagine you get into some partnership to depend on the US for life-saving medicines, and they just decide we'll just switch off the tap and impose unilateral sanctions against your country. You know, it's been a huge incentive for a large number of countries around the world to break with the financial and technological dependence on the US.
Yeah, no, that's
And
very important.
that's a good thing in many respects.
Yeah, no, it is important. But to go back and touch on the supreme leader of the Iranian regime, he's never trusted the US. It's more so the president that goes into discourse with the United States, and generals like the Mata Shahid al-Hajj Qasem Soleimani, who tried to ease and settle tensions between the two countries. Talk to us a bit about that, because you did get yourself taken off Facebook for that and a couple of other reasons in relations to that. What did that attack mean from the Trump and Netanyahu administration on Iraqi sovereignty, on international law, and how much of a violation to international law was such a tragedy?
Well, so you're talking about two things there. One, the murder of Qasem Soleimani, and secondly, the media response to it, I suppose. In the first instance, it was a treacherous, cowardly act by Trump to try and gain some sort of notoriety, to murder the greatest national heroes of both Iran and Iraq, when they were, in the case of Hajj Soleimani, an invited guest by the government of Iraq in Baghdad. Imagine murdering a guest who was invited into Iraq, which had, as we know, been destroyed by the US, and then has been hesitantly creating its own body politic, and gradually rebuilding some political will, some independent political will after the massive trauma and tragedy of the criminal invasion of that country, and then only got really the upper hand against Daesh, the notorious terrorist group created by the Saudis under US direction, because of the assistance from Iran, because of the assistance through the media of the regional commander Qasem Soleimani, not simply an Iranian general, but a general of the resistance who, as we know, had acted to help Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, at least. That the murder of Qasem Soleimani in 1 year, a bit over 1 year ago now, was a terrible, notorious crime. And if Trump wanted notoriety for it, I believe that he deserves that notoriety. We know now that Iran is going to proceed against, I think, more than 40 people involved in that assassination, and they will issue sentences against those people. And whether or not Interpol cooperates with that, which seems unlikely because the Western countries control Interpol basically, but whether or not that happens, there's going to be the beginnings of a process to show that complete immunity cannot attract to those sorts of crimes. They can't commit those crimes, boast about them, and then just carry on as if nothing happened. There are going to be consequences. And of course, the dangers of escalation are always there with that. But at some stage, the people on the resistance side of the equation are going to call the bluff of those that carry out these sorts of assassination, whether they're from Israel or the US or anywhere else, or local traitors that have to be dealt with too. Basically, I think that's going to become a fact of life. And unfortunately, there are the risks of escalation there, which only the responsible people involved can decide to take those sorts of decisions. So it was a notorious crime. I've written about it for a chapter in a book which is being published in Iran soon, which the main theme of which was that really the legend of Soleimani was sealed by his enemies in carrying out that murder, because in many respects that general had done 40 years of his work, including training commanders. He was training, remember, from the beginning of his career as a soldier in the war against Saddam Hussein, backed by the US also in that case. He was training people back at that time. He trained people for 40 years. And so even in the last year, he is a much more recognized political figure across the world than he was at the time of his death. He was very well known in the Middle East and there, but he is much better known a year later on. It reminds me of the image of Che Guevara in Latin America as one of these people who death does not destroy their legend, it actually enhances it. It doesn't do this for everyone, but for certain outstanding people, the legend of Soleimani has really been sealed by Trump. People are going to forget about Trump in a short period of time. They won't forget about Soleimani. And the legend there is, of course, reinforced by things that happened immediately after, which was, for example, that the different squabbling factions in Iraq, who, Iraq had been seriously weakened and I believe psychologically damaged by this whole invasion and destruction of Iraq since the invasion of 2003, that it was broken into squabbling factions, but they came together to demand the expulsion of US forces. As a result of that, the factions came together. This was the thing that united them, was the murder of Mohandas as well as Soleimani, basically. So that was the first step there. The resistance in the region, including the resistance in Lebanon and in Yemen, for example, also, and in Iran, demanded the expulsion of US forces from the entire region. In other words, a regional voice of the resistance was raised, in a sense, uniquely, not exactly for the first time, but uniquely a resistance voice, a combined force saying, get out of the region, Yankees, as the Latin Americans would say, Yankee, go home, basically. And of course, not a coincidence, the Latin Americans were all alive to this, all alive to it. The progressive forces in Latin America have been creating memorials to Qasem Soleimani. He is recognized in Latin America, across continents there. And we see greater cooperation now between, for example, Venezuela and Iran, with Iran providing relief to Venezuela, which is hit by the same sort of extreme unilateral coercive measures, wrongly called sanctions, which sounds sort of judicious, but it's not. So there is that level of cooperation has increased at a global level now. Now, moving to the media, I am thinking to write an article in the next couple of weeks, which is going to be headed something like "The Ghost of Soleimani Haunts the Colonial Media," basically, because you mentioned my Facebook account. Now, I've just got the 5th or 6th ban in the last year or so there, 3 of them to do with Soleimani. First of all, mourning the death of the great general in January. That's when they kicked me off in early 2020. At the end of 2020, another month for publishing a speech by his daughter, by Zainab Soleimani, who was mourning her father. So they were the last 2. And then the most recent one that happened a few days ago was that I then put up a little post saying, and this is what happened with Facebook in the last year, they did this before, Soleimani, his daughter, and then in between, I posted a picture of 2 Yemeni boys that were injured by Saudi air attacks, and they banned me for a month because they said this was nudity, because the 2 boys weren't wearing shirts, because they were injured, and you could see the injuries on their upper body, and they weren't wearing shirts, so they banned me for nudity there. And then, of course, what they've said, they've taken advantage of the pandemic to say, do you agree with this? Do you accept this? Or if you disagree, then we're sorry, we haven't got enough people. Because of the pandemic, we can't review these decisions. So, we just registered that you haven't agreed. Now, since then, someone, and I think it's in a subcontracted call center somewhere or other, probably in the southern US, basically, where they're hiring Mexicans and paying them very low amounts of money, they banned me for 30 days. This is the last few days. They banned me for 30 days for posting the reasons why for the previous bans. Then they changed it to 3 days. Now they've changed it to 7 days. So, there's no appeal, but someone there is shuffling the cards around, really. And it's not just me, of course. There are many thousands of people who are being blocked and banned in this sort of way. They are creating a lot of resentment, just as WhatsApp did, and that a lot of people have been abandoning WhatsApp because WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, is now demanding private information. So not just for political reasons, but for other reasons of privacy and whatever, people are abandoning WhatsApp and going to other channels like Telegram, which was originally Russian, so therefore strategically a bit more secure. Now it's in Germany or Dubai or something like that. But so these, the US-controlled social media outlets, and by the way, of course, they were blocking people before the murder of Soleimani, but when they started to block large numbers of people for, showing those pictures of the huge funerals for Soleimani and Mohandas in Iraq and then in Iran there, that was what they upset them. Imagine on the grounds of this being a dangerous person. Their boss, their government had already murdered him, but he remains a dangerous person to the colonial media. This is going to be the point of my next article, basically. How is it that this dead man is so dangerous to the colonial media that is perpetrating these myths about the war that their own government puts out? And then the explanation that Facebook gave, they actually responded back in January 2020 and said, look, we are a US organization, we're the victims here. We're a US organization, and US law says these people are, Hassan Nasrallah and all the rest of them are now Ansar Allah in Yemen as well, who are doing nothing but defending their own country. All these people that are designated as enemies or dangerous people or sanctioned, we have to respect a US law. Okay, good. That's their pretext. That's their pretext for introducing this censorial regime. But it came with the murder of Soleimani. That brought the tensions to a height there. And so it helps reinforce to millions of people that this so-called free press in the US is nothing of the sort. It never has been. It never has been. But it's being highlighted to so many people that, there are all these, imagine how many people are the US sanctions against in the world now. The last time I counted, there was at least 24 countries. And then because they sanction third parties, that's why the terrorist designation against Yemen is so evil, that really it threatens to, and the Caesar Act against Syria is so evil because it threatens to prosecute third parties who are helping do business with Syria or Yemen or whatever, and therefore reinforce those genocidal economic blockades against those countries, those and many other countries. It affects almost everyone in the world now. Trump simply took it to an extreme. Obama, for example, was a great master at this because unlike Bush, his predecessor, Obama, and I looked into this and I published it in the chapter on sanctions in my book, Axis of Resistance, which came out in 2019, that under Obama, a number of European banks were fined for doing business with Cuba and Iran, which were under sanction back then, under US unilateral coercive measure sanction back then. And Obama had the US Treasury, the Office of Financial Asset Control under Obama, had fined these European banks, imposed a penalty of several billion dollars, more than $5 billion, simply because they had done business which was not against the laws of their own country, but because they did business with the US or they had over 10% shareholding in the US felt that they could go and demand hundreds of millions of dollars from Credit Suisse or the Agricultural Bank of France and so on. And they paid up because the US would simply say to them, look, you want to do business in the US and you want to do business in Iran or Cuba, you make the decision. If you want to keep doing business in the US, pay us so many hundreds of millions of dollars. So the US has used that sanction regime as a means of extorting large amounts of money and compliance from their friends, from their allies, from the European countries, for example. So this is also bringing a lot of the contradictions of the world order to a head.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that you do say that, and you mentioned the sanctions and how America tries to cripple other countries and any party that's willing to help a country that has sanctions on them. Barack Obama's time in office, opposed to Donald Trump, were there many differences? Did Obama open the way or pave the way for Trump to continue doing what he did? Because in most circles, Obama is portrayed as a prime minister or a government, who came in, he changed and instilled change and gave freedom and liberation with his Obamacare. He started ties with the Iran nuclear deal, which was never in the realms of possibility to ever advance in. He would use his force. He said that he'd take the troops back, but instead he was doing illegal air strikes on target, strikes which happened with the General Soleimani, something where Trump did. So is there a difference between Obama and Trump? And how was the Obama administration, in your opinion?
There's a difference in style, for sure. In substance, not so much. And I think most of the world leaders affected by those regimes in Washington would say the same, except that, and I mean, you would see the governments in Iran and Syria are saying the same sort of thing, that we don't really pay much attention to the changing in system there because we know it's run by an oligarchy basically, and this oligarchy with large arms companies and the military and so on have a great continuity. There's a bit more hope in Latin America, I should say, because Obama recognized the failure of almost 60 years of economic blockade on Cuba and re-established relations with Cuba. Didn't remove the blockade because that was a function of the Congress of US law, but he did actually open diplomatic relations with Cuba, which Trump didn't reverse. And he visited Cuba. Now Trump reimposed the blockade measures on Cuba. But so there's a little bit more hope in also because Trump spoke very aggressively about Latin American emigration to the US, which is a big issue in Latin America. So there's a little bit more hope in Latin America that a reversion to the Obama style of things, the Biden regime, who was vice president under Obama, let's remember. And you're right in pointing out that the Obama administration took a lot of initiatives in war, opened 7 new wars at that time. That in many respects was a great continuity with Bush, because if we look at one factor in particular, the rise of Daesh in the Middle East, for example, ISIS, this was a group created by the Saudis at the direction of the US in Iraq in 2006, called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then the Islamic State in Iraq initially. And then it became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Iraq and the Levant, ISIS or ISIL. So, but that was created under the Obama administration, and we know now, due to the leaks from US intelligence, the DIA under Michael Flynn in particular, that the US was very happy in 2012 with the extension of Al-Qaeda in Iraq into eastern Syria, with the idea of creating a Salafi caliphate in eastern Syria, because it would help them in weakening and isolating Damascus. Now, that was the same rationale they'd given 6 years earlier in 2006 to creating it in Iraq, because they wanted to weaken the ties between the Maliki government in Baghdad and Iran. There was always going to be a natural coming together of Iran and Iraq after they'd got rid of Saddam Hussein. With a Shia-led government in Baghdad, it was not inevitable, but much more probable that there was going to be good neighborly relations, as you would expect, as would benefit the people of the region from there. The Bush administration was the one that created Daesh through the Saudis at that time, and with the bombings of Shia mosques and so on in Baghdad and in southern Iraq at that time. So there was that. I point that out, but to show the continuity with the Bush administration. It's true that the liberal side of US politics has been used more sophisticated language, and particularly this idea of smart power they've spoken of, and of using others to finance their wars, using proxy armies rather than the Bush-style invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. They will create Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh, those sorts of groups, and pretend they're coming organically from Sunni communities, from disaffected Sunni communities, when in fact they're being directly engineered by the Saudis and their allies at times in Qatar and the Emirates and Turkey, for example. Obama made those initiatives. Also, he was, in a sense, carried along with the momentum of the US project to destroy Libya in 2011. Let's not forget Libya, the African country with the highest standards of living. Here's someone who claims to be a great progressive advance because he's got some African background, although he grew up middle-class white in the US. He was responsible for the destruction of, with France and some of the Europeans, the destruction of the administration under Gaddafi, which had led to the highest living standards in Africa, amongst the highest status of women in Africa too. These are not small things; they are important things. And Libya was destroyed and driven back into a state from which it still hasn't recovered. And now there's a great power struggle for influence there, between France and Turkey and Russia and Egypt and so on. and Little Libya is being walked over, and there are open-air slave markets there. So that happened under Obama. Now, as I said, the Latin Americans will remember that he admitted the failures of US policy and re-established relations with Cuba. Notice one thing here. The only reason that Obama did that with Cuba in 2014 was because in 2013, Cuba had been over the years, over the decades, gradually getting all the Latin American states to support them, partly through good diplomacy, partly through medical diplomacy, the export of Cuban doctors, one of the greatest initiatives in recent decades of sending large numbers of doctors to other countries to parallel the US sending troops to other countries. Cuba has sent, I think, over 26 medical brigades to countries in the last year to help deal with the COVID epidemic, for example, and very little credit's been given to that. But anyway, in 2013, Cuba was elected president of CELAC, the Council of Latin American and Caribbean States, heading the bloc of 600 million people in the Americas, twice as big as the US, basically. And so the plan by the US over many decades to isolate Cuba, as they tried to isolate Korea, as they tried to isolate Syria and Yemen and so on, failed. It blew up in their faces. Cuba had more support in the Americas than the US did, and the US was effectively isolated. And that's why Obama, as a realist rather than a liberal, re-established relations and really he did a very good PR move there. Now Trump reversed all that, but in some respects, Trump said a number of honest things in the campaign in 2016. He recognized that Hillary Clinton and Obama had been, the creators of the Al Qaeda groups plaguing Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Libya. But he wasn't able to reverse it. He was an outsider in some respects. He got the support of the Republican Party, but what they call the deep state didn't really recognize him. So to some extent, Trump was a pragmatist who wanted to get out of the losing wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, for example, but he wasn't able to do it. And then he committed all these vulgar, violent crimes, the worst of which probably was the murder of Soleimani and Mohandas, and then after that, his Secretary of State trying to worsen the blockade on Yemen by designating Ansarallah as a terrorist group. That was a terrible crime too, which hopefully the Biden administration will revert. But what I've been trying to, in this long-winded answer, what I've been trying to point out is there's great continuity between those different regimes. The liberal regimes like Clinton and Obama and Biden typically put a better gloss on things and make some innovations in deceptive, dirty wars. Remember, the war on Yemen began under Obama too. Trump carried them through. Bush, who didn't invade Afghanistan for the rights of women in Afghanistan, nevertheless, at the end of the day, that's what they were saying. We have occupied this country for 2 decades because the rights of women in Afghanistan. Of course, that was nothing to do with the real reason they went there, But so they are sort of liberal innovations to put these pathetic, really, but vexatious stories as a gloss on top of their crimes. And then it's vexatious because the colonial, what I call the colonial media, uses it to maintain the pretext for those sorts of wars. They're still trying to overthrow Damascus because Bashar al-Assad has been killing children and bombing his own hospitals. It was ludicrous to start with. It's never been plausible at all. But because the war is going on, they keep those sorts of things going on. And the most pathetic pretexts they keep using. They used the weapons of mass destruction against Iraq. Later on, they laughed and admitted it was all false when they had destroyed Iraq. With Iran, they're talking about its nuclear weapons. There's never been any evidence for that, but they have the colonial media, singing along in chorus, and a lot of their paid collaborators in the social media. Let's remember that under Obama, a lot of these so-called NGOs were created, media activists, either Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi people, or Western agencies like Bellingcat and but the Aleppo Media Service or whatever it was, the guy based in England, what's his name, Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, all of these sorts of people. The British and the Americans and the French fund all these sorts of people to keep the propaganda going. We are much deeper in propaganda these days than we ever were back in the days of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. You know, the need to try and convince or diffuse highly educated populations in the 21st century is much greater, and the wars rely on these propaganda wars much more than they ever have. Anyway, I've gone on too long. Sorry.
No, you're right, mate. Look, it's funny and it's interesting as civilization goes towards modernity, and we feel that we are God's gift on earth, and we're so advanced with all the technology that's come out. We still face the same problems, the same dilemma, the same control, and the same propaganda that we did in yesteryear. So the same tactics of World War I and World War II are still ongoing. They may have gained a bit of legs and arms with the technology that they have and the mass media, but it's basically the same substance. So
yeah, the principles are very similar, and the principles of independence, sovereignty, non-intervention, all of those things that were established in international law in the mid to late 20th century, which is fortunate for people of the resistance, people who are opposing imperialism, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and so on, or apartheid. That resistance has the benefit now that international law has shifted to favour us rather than to favour the imperialists. But of course, we have to make use of those tools in this context of propaganda with many more arms and legs, as you've said.
yeah, no, 100%. And I feel that is the way. Joe Biden, so the Joe Biden administration, what hope do we have in the Middle East, sanction-wise? What hope does Latin America have? What hope does the world have with this new administration? Are we going to see the same power-struck incompetence that the Trump administration had? Or are we going to move towards getting America some recognition and some principles on the world stage? Do we have any hope with Joe Biden's administration?
See, in my view, the hope is really that Biden can do what his former superior Obama did in 2014, recognize failure. What Obama did with Cuba in 2014 after a economic war, blockade, terrorism against Cuba since the early 1960s was to admit failure and to retreat from that position, begin to retreat from that position. It's not that they're going to resolve anything. It's not that any administration in Washington is going to be part of a solution in the Middle East. They have to be defeated and to admit defeat. Actually, they are defeated. I was talking to a senior general in Syria a bit over a year ago in Damascus, and we were talking about the north and the very strange position in the north where you've got this Kurdish proxies and you've got the Russians there with the Syrians and Erdogan's gangs and so on. It's very complicated, basically, and the Kurdish groups are, buoyed up in some parts by the US presence and buoyed up by dollars also. And in other areas, they're working with the Russians and the Syrians and so on. So it's very complicated. Anyway, this general said to me, look, they know they've lost. They know that we know they've lost, but they want to keep punishing us, basically. They are there to... They're bad losers, the Americans. I remember it from Vietnam. It took them a very long time from recognizing that they'd lost in their war in Vietnam to actually withdrawing. And when they withdrew, by the way, they withdrew under something called the Guam Doctrine, set up by Nixon, or the Nixon Doctrine, which was that they were withdrawing from the whole of Indochina to Guam, to the island of Guam, where they have a military base. And they were going to let their proxies do the work for them, basically. They were going to subcontract out, in today's terms, their wars. Now, they've done that already to a degree. We know that they use some of the petro-monarchies in the Persian Gulf to, finance and arm their wars and sell them the weapons and pass them on to whoever. But there is talk within the Washington, and not to do with the Biden administration particularly, because it was happening under Trump. Indeed, Trump, to some extent, encouraged it in the final days. You notice he appointed a new defense secretary with new security officials there, and they were all people, even though he didn't act on it much in the end, they were all people who favoured a withdrawal from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Now, what does this mean? It means that they've lost in Afghanistan. They've lost, they're going to pull out, the Taliban will take over. Whatever we think about the Taliban, they are an indigenous group that has maintained resistance for 2 decades. They're distorted in a way that's been created by their particular history, but nevertheless, the US has not been able to assert itself over Afghanistan in 2 decades. So you know that they're unwanted in Iraq. You know that they've been defeated in Syria. So the idea generally is, and it isn't really coate in the sense that it's not hasn't formed a particular doctrine, but it probably will have a name sometime in the near future. And this may happen under the Biden administration, or it may take another administration later, that they will pull back to a line, say North Jordan, Kuwait, basically evacuating Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, pulling back to, they've got their biggest bases in Qatar and Kuwait and so on. They've got the Saudis there, they've got Jordan, Israel for the time being. But allowing their so-called allies like Erdogan to take over the job of trying to fragment and weaken northern Syria and northern Iraq. We know that Erdogan would like to get control of the northern parts of Syria and Iraq. He's already occupying large areas in northern Syria and Iraq. Let him do that. Keep getting the Saudis to fund and arm these groups to fragment the independent states. We should include Lebanon in that now, because Lebanon has advanced to the point where, even though Lebanon was a state set up to fail from the beginning, really, sectarianized, with an artificial Maronite majority, which is now about a third of the country, most of which now support the resistance. That's why Lebanon has come into the sphere now, and is effectively, like Iraq, being targeted in the economic war. Like once they start to impose an economic war on certain parties in the country, and in Iraq, the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, and not just Hezbollah in Lebanon, but anyone associated with them. So people in the the majority Maronite party, which is in alliance with Hezbollah in Lebanon. What's his name? The foreign minister there, who is now also been targeted for sanctions. What's that guy's name?
In Lebanon?
In Lebanon, yeah. The younger man who is Aoun's deputy, who's the foreign minister there. Anyway, so they're targeting leading Maronite politicians in Lebanon, not just Hezbollah. So that the net has widened to the point where the entire Lebanese economy and the entire Iraqi economy is being sabotaged by the US. Effectively, you have an economic war from Beirut and Tartus to Tehran, or to Afghanistan, effectively. So the US can keep engaged in futile wars across that whole region to try and weaken them, or it can pull back and hand over the task effectively, or try to hand over the task to its proxies there. I mean, that's one reason why we have Daesh now in Afghanistan. A lot of the commanders, the experience, knowledge of the experience, technology, let's say, of Daesh, they didn't really care about the mercenaries, the foot soldiers, but the experienced commanders, they did. And so they pulled them out of the Euphrates and out of parts of Iraq also, and moved them to safe zones so they could bring them back and use them, whether to use them in Iraq and Syria again, or to use them in Afghanistan. Because remember, and now they have the Taliban fighting Daesh in Afghanistan also. So that's important to them, because they want to surround Iran and try and weaken Iran. They know that they can't invade Iran. Iran is too strong and too unified for that. It's a much bigger country than all the rest of them. But they can surround it and keep attacking it with Daesh, with the MEK, and with their other assets, basically, carry out these sorts of activities to try and weaken and distract Iran. Because what they most fear is a unified bloc, from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, across the region, all of a sudden now on the frontier of occupied Palestine, and threatening to retake the Golan Heights there, for example. So there's the problem. The Biden administration now, in terms of that big picture, the Biden administration is unlikely to have more political will than a more extreme right-wing regime, in my view, because Biden is a piece of fluff in many respects, a creature of the system. He will go which way the system is going. That's why the establishment media like him so much. That's why they favoured him so much. Remember, according to the official figures, still over 70 million people voted for Trump. Almost half the people in the US voted for Trump. But if you looked at the media, you would think that he was a hated figure that was like Lenin Moreno in Ecuador were less than 10% support publicly. That's not at all the case. On the other hand, Biden's support in the US is exaggerated by the fact that the New York Times, the Washington Post, a number of these sorts of mainstream agencies are very committed to this more sophisticated liberal idea of US exceptionalism, US imperialism. So the downside to that is that the Biden administration, in some respects, is less likely to take controversial initiatives. And the problem there is that with their big wars in the world, like the anti-Russian campaign, the Congress was far worse than Trump in that respect. I don't know if you remember that, but the Congress voted for sanctions against Trump's will on Russia. That meant both major parties were in this game. And the Biden administration has already said that they are still, engaged in this whole process against China, falsely claiming that there is some war against Muslims in Western China, which, as if the US ever cared about Muslims, but they're using that as a tool against China, basically. The Venezuela campaign that Trump had ramped up with some pathetic failed attempts at, but nevertheless dangerous attempts at coups in Venezuela. Biden has doubled down on that. He's going to support that. Trump has raised the stakes in Iran, and it's very difficult. And I think, and I've spoken a little bit about this recently, that even though Biden was part of the original nuclear deal with Iran 6 years ago, I don't think it's possible for Biden to go back and simply say nothing ever happened in the last 6 years, basically. I don't think that Biden can undo all the damage that Trump did with his aggression against Iran there. Trump didn't understand things. He wanted to get out of losing wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, but somehow he thought he could maintain the aggression against Iran. They were all linked to the US, to the smarter people in the US oligarchy. It was all part of the same thing. They hate Iran because Iran is the big power in amongst the independent blocs, and the one that's able to give support to Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and other independent forces in the region, Yemen, for example. So Iran has always been at the center of their strategic plan to take over and create what they call the new Middle East, with their leading proxies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, basically. And any independent will there, from Yemen to Afghanistan, had to be wiped out, basically. Now that's failing, but Iran has always been at the center of it. Now the problem is that Trump increased the rhetoric and the murders and the economic war, what did he call it? Maximum pressure against Iran. I don't think it will be possible for Biden just to go back and say, okay, we re-agree to all the terms in 2015 that we created in the first place. There was nothing in it for Iran to engage in that except to get rid of sanctions. That was the only so-called reward for Iran back then. They only did it under extreme pressure because it wasn't just the US and the Europeans. Russia and China were involved as well. Iran had the Security Council against them back in those days. Now look what's happened since then. Since when the discussions began a decade or so ago, Russia and China are in totally different positions in relation to the Middle East. Totally different positions. They will never go back into a campaign against Iran in that way. The Europeans didn't like what Trump did, but they were too spineless to actually start doing business with Iran again. They created a mechanism called Instex to try and do business with Iran, but the US successfully threatened them to say, you do business with Iran and we will use the SWIFT mechanism, US dollar and all the rest of it to, black ban you and fine you, like Obama was fining all of the banks for doing business with Cuba and Iran in Obama's time there. So the Europeans weren't able to get out of that. Now, so even though there's a division of opinion in Iran between the liberals and the principalists, the big political division that exists in Iran there, maybe not very well recognized in the West, they tend to call them the hardliners, and I don't know what they call the Rouhani party, but they are genuine liberals. They do believe in a lot of economic liberalism and so on, and a lot of that's quite unpopular in Iran now, particularly because of the failure of the nuclear deal. There was a couple of years where they got some economic benefits from it, but I think the argument that's going to sway Biden is that they will lose their leverage against Iran if they simply go back and don't try and impose some new conditions. And Iran's not going to accept new conditions. Why should it? There's nothing in Iran for it. They've already burned all their political, the US has already burnt all its political goodwill by doing their worst against Iran, assassinating their national hero, having the strongest economic war siege measures against Iran that they can possibly do. What else are they going to do? There's no more cards that they can pull on. Nevertheless, in the US, as arrogant as they are, they will say, we can't just go back there because we'll be giving influence back to Iran. So there will be an internal struggle in Iran. There could even be a change of government in Iran this year, which may dig in what the West calls the hardliners against any new deal. But even now, the Rouhani administration is not inclined to give anything. Why should they give anything to the US? So it will be difficult, that's what I'm saying in a long-winded way again, for Biden to make an initiative there with Iran, basically. With Syria, it's a failure. With Iraq, it's a failure. They know that not just the Hashid al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units, but the entire parliament and the government of Iraq, whoever is the prime minister of Iraq, it doesn't matter. They all want the US out. How will Biden deal with that? What's he going to go back to saying, oh, we're there because of the Kurds, we're there because of women, or we're there because of this and that and the other thing? I mean, we can't deny that the liberal side of US politics under Obama made some significant advances. A lot of Western people think, oh yes, the women in Afghanistan, oh yes, the poor Kurds in northern Syria, or whatever it is. A lot of them think those sorts of things. So they succeeded in the propaganda war through all their proxies, through the colonial media, and through all of the hired NGOs and so on. But I find it hard to see what new mechanisms Biden will find, what new deceptive mechanisms Biden will find to keep the status quo going. And that leaves, pardon me, this option of, which could be the Biden doctrine or could be something else, that they will decide to pull back to Jordan and Kuwait and say, let the Saudis and Erdogan deal with trying to keep Iraq and Syria divided and fighting amongst themselves, and we'll keep, sending in forces to help Daesh. But Daesh and the SDF will collapse if the US leaves Syria, for example, and leave Iraq. Daesh and SDF will be gone extremely quickly. One thing that impressed on me a lot, that fact, was that I happened to be in northern Syria end of 2019, went up to around Manbij and was talking to some Syrians and Kurdish groups that were working together, because in some parts of Syria, the SDF, if they don't have US there, the Russians and the Syrians are stopping Erdogan and Erdogan's gangs attacking them, basically. And I happened to see some military maps there, and the SDF, which at that time, and I think still, run the administration of Manbij city, which is a very big city now, more than 500,000 people. It is run administratively by this SDF, this proxy group created by the US out of Kurdish separatists who are largely led by the Turkish Kurdish separatists, which are much bigger than the Syrian ones. That city is run by the SDF administratively, but it's defended by the Syrians and the Russians. There's a whole lot of armor all around Manbij, defending it from Erdogan's troops and, all of those other proxies they call the Free Syrian Army or the Syrian National Army or whoever it is, from attacking the Kurdish groups there, basically. So there's a highly artificial situation there, but it's only because the US has that token presence there, but it's a token presence which is enough because it deters attacks from the Russians and the Syrians directly, for fear of greater intervention there. So will Biden maintain that status quo? I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of, let me end on an optimistic note on this. Another long answer is that I think there's room to pressure the Biden regime over things like Trump's designation of Ansarallah as a terrorist group, because that is definitely going to worsen the situation of the Yemeni people as a whole. The next cab after that is the sanctions on Syria, which are clearly hurting the people of Syria and, of course, the economies of Syria. And
We have, again, technical difficulties. We have momentarily lost Tim, hoping to regain him. Tim, we still have not regained connection. Hoping he comes back in the next moment. But basically, we're talking about the Joe Biden administration and what he has.
Is in precisely these areas where there is
Sorry, Tim,
serious
we lost you for a bit. I'm just sorry. If you can rewind about 20, 30 seconds.
Okay, so what I was trying to finish by saying was that I think the room for advances under the Biden regime is to pressure them over these most sensitive areas, the humanitarian impact on Yemen of the last minute move to try and designate Ansar Allah as a terrorist group, which is enhancing the blockade and the potentially leading to thousands, if not tens of thousands of death in Yemen. And after that, the siege on Syria, which also affects Lebanon, that is to say the impact, the humanitarian impact on the great majority of the civilian population in Syria of those extreme sanction measures which the Trump administration aggravated after the measures imposed by the Obama regime. There's room for withdrawal, for retreat in those areas, I think. But I find it hard to see the Biden administration taking any really positive initiative other than simply those retreats.
Yeah, it's interesting. From the last three presidents, I think Joe Biden's in a position that is catastrophic. I think it's in all sorts. He's got his own country up against him. He's got 70 million people that he's got to reunite. He's got the vaccines, and he's got a lot going on, with the COVID, in the Middle East, it's in all sorts and in tatters. So it's very interesting as to how he will respond. And we can only hope that he uses the more sensible and responsible way and hopefully comes to ties, especially because he has said that he will withdraw Saudi support in Yemen. And hopefully he does go and, not put Ansar Allah and take them off the terrorist group list. And he does hopefully we do see the sanctionees in Iran and they do come back to the table, because ultimately I don't think that more conflict or more war in the Middle East is the solution to anything.
I think you point to an important thing there, that the internal crisis in the US, because of the political division and also the fact that they have Trump, but the US system more generally has mishandled their epidemic so badly. They are still not a long way from being out of the woods there, and people are hurting economically from that. There's massive recession happening now. There's massive increased inequality as a result of their mishandling that epidemic, and it's not getting better in a hurry. So those things are a disaster for the US people, but in some way provide a ray of hope for the external wars, because to an extent they weaken the capacity and the will of a US administration to keep inflicting damage on other people when there's so much pain happening at home.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I do hope to see a better 21 and future ahead, and hopefully the US do behave and make the sensible decision under the Biden administration. However, it remains unlikely if we were to look at his predecessors. Yeah, they usually use same substance, different ways, different methods. Tim, it has been an honor and a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for coming on and sharing and enlightening us with wisdom. And thank you very much. We will do this in the future if you're open to it. Any last comments?
No, just thank you very much for raising those questions and carrying out such an intelligent interview. You're obviously well informed in a number of these areas, and it's a pleasure to talk to you, someone who's so genuine and so well educated in these areas, because unfortunately we can't say that about most of the rest of the media in this country.
No, thank you. The pleasure is mine. I'm a student of the game. I got a lot to learn, a lot of growth to do. But looking at people like yourself and seeing the way that you've paved, it makes it more possible. And I aspire to be a benefit to the people. Hopefully people can take what we said and use it and maybe broaden their horizon, add to the arsenal. And hopefully they weren't too bored and they enjoyed the podcast. Thank you very much, Timmy.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Champion, enjoy it. Thank you.